Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of the Benchwarmer Sports Podcast. Raffi here, joined by Davian and our college bracketologist and bracket expert, Jonah. Jonah, great to have you back on again. Davian, always a pleasure to be speaking with you, as you know all too well. Guys, it's finally that time of year where my bracket addiction is at its peak. I love brackets. There's a bracket now. I've already made 3. I'm planning on making probably upwards of 15, maybe a little bit more than that. I have a very crippling bracket addiction, but it's okay. There's worse things to be addicted to than brackets, so I'm honestly not complaining too much. I'm doing pretty well right now. The bracket looks great. I don't think there's too much to say. Jonah, I know you do your bracketology, so we'll get into that. A little bit of your thoughts on the field, but personally looking at it, I don't have too many problems. There's a couple seed lines that I think could potentially be swapped. Some teams could be bumped up a little bit. Some teams could be bumped down a little bit. But I think the committee got it right with the 68 teams. I really don't have too much qualms over who got in and who didn't get in. I'm pretty happy with the teams at least. But before we get into that, Davian, Jonah, how are you guys? David, I'm assuming you're not doing too great because you unfortunately had to bear witness to the horror that was Cornell losing to Yale, in which we discussed this over text, but just to do this right now, get this just out of the way at the intro. I told you so. I told you that Yale was going to beat Cornell. But anyways, before we get into things, how are you both doing? I can't wait. This is one of the peak times of the year for me. I love this time of year so much.
You know, Raffi, I was so excited for Cornell to go dancing and watching them, in the semifinal and then the final and make it in. And just didn't happen. I woke up super early, 8 a.m. for St. Patrick's Day celebrations. I went to that stupid gym, our arena, which is more like a gym, at 11 a.m. Proceeded to watch them lose and proceeded to leave and continue to enjoy St. Patty's Day. Any case though, huge congrats to UPenn. I think that they're a great team. They got some special players on there. With that being said though, it is March. I'm super excited. March Madness officially starts on my birthday, which is on Thursday. So, it's pretty cool. But yeah, besides that, I'm excited. I'm pumped. Jonah, how have you been? I know that last year you had a lot of qualms with the brackets and your predictions and everything. How you feeling this year? You think that they got it more right this year than last year? And generally, how you been?
Yeah, I've been fine. As I'm not on campus, I did not bear witness to Cornell's poor play in the conference tournament. They wasted their prior victory against Yale in that same arena. Eventually, the size caught up to them. They couldn't get enough boards and they couldn't get baskets when they needed them. But if we want to move into the brackets, I'm not going to share too much, but let's say last year, if I had to grade them, it would be a generous C. This year, they did pretty well. I would say solid B+, and I'm not an easy grader.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and overall, what were your big qualms, if you really had any? What kept the committee from getting that A grade? Because for me, I look at things, I think St. John's on the 5 line was really the big thing that stood out to me. It was a little confusing. Vanderbilt at the 5 was also a little bit. I think you could have potentially made an argument for them being bumped up, but overall, NC State maybe could have been on. I saw bracketologies with them as high as the 9 line, so them being one of the last 4 in. But anything that you kind of noticed, Miami, Ohio, I'm just glad that they're in, honestly, because that was, if they left a 1-loss Miami, Ohio out, I know I would be very upset, and I would not have even gotten this intro off because Davian would be, what are we in, 4 minutes into this podcast? Davian would still be in the midst of his rant about how the selection committee is terrible and they should all be fired from their jobs immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have been livid. There would be no questions about that.
Yeah, so onto Miami. I actually think their seed is it's a very nuanced discussion with them, but I think the committee got it for the most part correct. I mean, I think in Dayton makes sense. I did tell some people that if the committee left out Miami, I would quit watching college basketball. And one really interesting thing to talk about with them is what the chairman, Keith Gill, said about their inclusion. They were the last team in on the basis of their official ranking, but he said they were not the last team selected, which kind of talks about their scrubbing process and how they select teams to be in the tournament, and once they figure out who's going to be in, then they adjust how they're ranked, which makes me think that even if we only had a 64-team field, Miami still would have gotten in and been the last team in. It was just definitely their lack of impressive performance, for lack of a better term, which is what made them slide to being that very final at-large selection from a ranking perspective.
Yeah, and I think conference realignment has also affected things a lot in terms of the rankings, just because there's all these bracket principles where, well, you don't want the 1 and 2 seed to be in the same conference, and you want to try to align things as well to where you don't have too many of one conference in one quadrant. And when you have so many SEC teams now, so many more Big Ten teams, more Big 12 teams, it's going to create situations where you're going to have to put some schools in uncomfortable situations or potentially bump them down a seed, bump other schools up a seed line, just because of we need to adhere to the bracketing principles. Now, obviously, again, I've talked about St. John's enough, but I do think conference realignment is having a bit of an effect when we're looking at this final bracket. But without further ado, again, we're on record time with that. That was, I think, 2 minutes, very calm, very chill. No one mentioned Auburn, so honestly, that was great. Much better than last year, although that was well warranted. Let's get into the East. We'll just go around each respective quadrant, give our predictions, and then we'll come together for our Final Four and then do our championship. So, Davian, I'll give you the honor first. How do you have the East playing out, the East quadrant?
Great question. The East is really diabolical the way they set it up. I think in a way that's the most exciting really region to watch. I feel like every game is almost a must watch. I'll kind of run through it. Right now in the Sweet 16, I have Duke and St. John's, as well as Louisville and UCLA. Why do I have that? I have Louisville upsetting Michigan State in the round of 32, and I have UCLA upsetting UConn in the round of 32 as well. Michigan State has not really impressed me, especially in the latter half of the season. And UConn, as much as I believe in UConn's ability to do well in March, I don't think this is their year. I think there's been too many flaws in that team, and they've been shown greatly by some of the the most competitive teams out there. I really like this UCLA team. I think they could really pull something together, which is why I have them moving on to Sweet 16. So with that being said, out of the East, the team I have making it out is St. John's. I have St. John's beating Duke and then St. John's beating UCLA. I really like the St. John's team to go for.
Wow. I was going to be on it. I respect that poll. I was not expecting it. St. John's is excellent. My Sweet 16 is the same, except I had UConn over UCLA.
Okay.
I think UConn is on upset alert, but for some reason, every UConn team for the past several years has always just been terrible in the Big East compared to in the non-conference. Like, I think there's a stat they've lost 2 non-conference games in the past 4 or 5 years, and they've obviously lost a lot more conference games. And they play some heavy hitters.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling they're going to find a way to get out.
Fair.
At least out of UCLA. Then on to the other games from the Sweet 16. I do have it as an ACC rematch, Duke versus Louisville. Both those teams, they're strong. They're strong almost everywhere. They have people who can take over a game. Obviously, Duke, you got Cam Boozer, you got Michael Brown for Louisville. But I think at the end, Duke is just more talented. They're my pick. Go Final Four.
Yeah, my big thing with Louisville, though, is Michael Brown. We know his availability is in question, so we don't really know to what extent he'll be playing, if he'll even be playing in this tournament for Louisville. So that's been the big thing for me. I have South Florida over Louisville. That's one of my 11 over 6s that I have in my bracket, just because that's a concern for me. But surprisingly, Davian, you'd be surprised by this, but I actually do have St. John's also coming out of this quadrant. I completely agree with you. I don't think it's a ridiculous take. Duke, we know, is banged up. They're down some of their big guys. Caleb Foster, obviously, a big piece, and they have a lot of guys who are dinged up. They played really close versus Florida State in the ACC tournament and didn't really look like Duke down the stretch once these injuries started to pick up. So especially because we know that Foster's not going to be playing the rest of the tournament, I think that that's going to be a big hindrance for Duke. And when I look at some of these other teams, yes, it's pretty loaded, but Michigan State on the 3 line, I get why they're there. I don't really like Michigan State too much. It's very weird for me to go against Tom Izzo in March, but I just don't have the vibes this year. I'm not really feeling Michigan State, especially after looking at how they performed in the Big Ten tournament and just overall down the stretch. They have some impressive wins, but overall, it's not the resume that I'm looking for if I want to pick a three seed going really deep into this tournament. And then UConn, I have UConn over UCLA to put UConn up versus Michigan State in the Sweet 16. UConn
Raffi,
has shown
boring, man.
I picked St. John's coming out though.
But yeah, I know. But continue.
But again, like if we go through things, I have Duke over TCU, St. John's over Kansas. Kansas has been up and down. I would not be surprised if Kansas finally figures it out, but they just have not. So I'm going St. John's over Kansas. I have Michigan State over South Florida. Again, I just discussed why I had South Florida over Louisville, but I have Michigan State over South Florida. Wouldn't be shocked if South Florida beats Michigan State. That would not surprise me one bit. And then I have UConn over UCLA. And then I have I'm going to go UConn over Michigan State, call an audible. St. John's over Duke, and then St. John's beating UConn for a third time. Outside of that one time that UConn just completely beat the brakes off St. John's has beaten UConn the other 2 times, obviously winning the Big East title. And this St. John's team, as opposed to last year, this year they've shown more signs that they're better and more consistent offensively. And that's the big thing. They still maintain that really good defensive structure. I think they're really very physical. They're going to get into really affect Duke, and really, again, with the injuries, I think it's going to hinder Duke. And when I look at St. John's, the big thing for me is I know Alabama's offense or defense is rather quite poor, but the fact that St. John's was going shot for shot with Alabama a few months ago really stands out to me as, okay, I can invest in this team. I can see the shots falling more often rather than last year, where I was like, they haven't shown enough for me offensively versus high caliber opponents, where I think that they can go on a deep run, which is why I had them bowing out quite early last year, which did wind up happening.
Fair.
Honestly, very respectable take. Like, even though last year St. John's was a 2 and this St. John's team is a 5, I think straight up this St. John's team is better.
Yeah,
I agree. You can make an argument that they could be on the 3 line. And for me, if you had put St. John's and Michigan State and swapped those spots, I would have St. John's going still all the way through. I think St. John's, and I mean, again, the AP poll isn't what makes the bracket. Obviously, the selection committee is a separate entity. But not to say the AP poll is all be all end all, but AP poll has St. John's as 10.
Yeah.
That's literally on the verge of being on the 2 line. So I think they were massively underseeded. I know a lot of people are complaining about that, but I think that's going to give them some more motivation to really push and have a good showing this tournament, especially after how disappointing last year was.
Yeah, I don't want to get into specifics, but Raffi, why do you have TCU over Ohio State? I haven't really followed either of these teams really that much. Is there a specific reason why you kind of chose that, or is it kind of like a vibes thing, like you said, to an extent?
Part of it's vibes. Part of it is Ohio State hasn't really shown me enough to where I really think that they are necessarily better than them. Ohio State, really big notable wins versus Purdue and Wisconsin, but outside of that, they haven't looked good versus a lot of the higher end caliber opponents. TCU, the big thing for me, they obviously have a win versus Iowa State. They have a win versus Texas Tech, but Davian, out of all the teams to beat Florida, TCU is one of them. TCU beat Florida right around Thanksgiving.
Right.
So
true.
There's TCU, I think, and again, I've listened to so many people and I've done so much prep work, so I've heard this from a billion people at this point. But the point is, TCU, I think, could put up a fight versus Duke. I don't think they're going to beat Duke. I'm not going to commit to that. I don't clip myself. But I would not be surprised if that game with Duke's injuries is closer than people imagine, and if that game is tighter and more down to the wire than people thought going into that game.
Fair take. Jonah, your
thoughts?
Not particularly. It's an 8-9 game. TCU versus Ohio State's kind of a pick-em.
Yeah.
I think I lay an edge Ohio State just because they're finally showing that, okay, these close losses that they were taking to these good teams that made their numbers look prettier than their resume, they're finally becoming wins now. Like, they had the win over Purdue. They actually beat a tournament team outside of their home venue in Iowa. And then they took Michigan State. They took Michigan to the brink of in both those games. I think it's going to translate to the tournament. Give me Ohio State.
Yeah. Again, I completely agree. It's really a toss-up, but the CCU team, I think, has shown a little bit more for me, shown that they can beat some better teams than the Ohio State. So we'll see what happens, but I don't want to dwell too much on an A9 matchup as we discussed.
Yeah, I agree.
Moving over to the South, Jonah, I'll hand this one over to you. We have the potential for a rematch of last year's championship, so I'm intrigued to see how you think that the South is going to play out.
Yeah, so if we'll start at the Sweet 16, yeah, it's pretty chalky. I don't know if I have that many shockers, at least in the first two rounds. The only one I would even consider is VCU. They've actually been playing very well over the past month or so. And even in the A10, those results were not as close as those scores suggested. They kind of dominated those games and just didn't took their foot off the gas pedal at the end of them. So I do have VCU beating North Carolina. That's my primary upset in that region. But for the Sweet 16, I have basically chalk. I have Illinois versus Houston and Florida versus Vandy. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm feeling it with this Florida team. I think people don't realize how good Vanderbilt is. Like, when I said the selection committee was at a B+ and not an A-, Vanderbilt was my biggest qualm. This Vanderbilt team is good, they're deep, and they can do whatever, and they have a bunch of good Tylers on their team. I'm going to say it, Vanderbilt over Florida, and Vanderbilt is unfortunately, though, going to bow down to the Houston Cougars, who, whenever they need a shot, they can just get it, and they have plenty of people who can do it. They're so good, they're so collected, they're so balanced. I always feel like they're never out of the game, regardless of what the score is. Vanderbilt versus Houston, it's going to be a game for the ages, but give me Houston to the Final Four.
Yeah, right. Really interesting with this. If it goes chalky up Florida Houston, which happens to be in Houston, so you're not really giving Florida too much of an advantage as the one going into this quadrant and in this region. VCU, I completely agree. VCU's looked great. Their offense has really been clicking. They play solid defensively too. With Caleb Wilson being out for North Carolina, I have VCU over UNC. It's another 11/6 that I have. And with Illinois, I wear this as an alumni of Illinois. I'm wearing this Illinois shirt. They are so good offensively, but in March, they're just too inconsistent for me to pick this school going really, really far. And I've really dwelled over the fact of, am I going to pick VCU over Illinois? Which I don't think is a stretch by any means. And my bracket is subject to change. This is Monday, March 16th at 7:27 as we're recording Central Time. As we're recording this podcast, I am going to be flipping back between VCU and Illinois over the next couple of days, really mulling that matchup over, because I think it's a good matchup for VCU, and I would not be surprised if VCU was able to overtake Illinois. I'm pretty much shocked the rest of the way. I have Vanderbilt over Nebraska. Nebraska finally is the final Power 5 program to win a game in March Madness. They finally do it. They beat Troy. If they lost to Troy, it'd be really disappointing. Kind of funny, but really, it would encapsulate Nebraska sports. But also, I'd obviously feel bad. They had a really good year for the most part. But yeah, I agree. Vanderbilt, I think, is just going to have their way with Nebraska. I don't think Nebraska's really up to the caliber of Vanderbilt, although Nebraska's a seed higher than them. I have Florida over Vanderbilt. I get what you're saying about Florida, but the last month going into the SEC tournament, it really looked like Florida was back. They were absolutely dominant. They blew out several teams, especially Alabama too, and Arkansas. They really just showed. If this was November, December, I would be a lot more in agreement with you. Like, I don't really know if this Florida team is what they were last year. I had some qualms about them early on in the year, but really in February, they flipped a switch. And although they had a bad game versus Vanderbilt, I can't imagine that they're going to have another poor shooting game against a team like Vanderbilt. So I have Florida over Vanderbilt to take on Houston. And although they're playing in Houston, I'm going to go with Florida over Houston to advance to the Final Four. that, again, things are subject to change. I don't want to be the guy. Davian knows this all too well. I'm very in between, and I will say both things, not intentionally to make myself right, at least in some fashion, but just because I'm very indecisive. I'm going to go with Florida with the possibility of Houston. We'll get into that matchup later down the line once we get to the Final Four, but I'm going to go Florida over Houston for the time being. Davian.
Yeah, Raffi. All respect to Illinois, but there's a guy. His name's TJ Power. I call an upset alert right there. I really like this UPenn team. I really think that they are going to go on a Cinderella run. They'll get destroyed, all of their hopes, by VCU in the second round. I agree with you guys. I do think VCU wins in the first round. I agree that VCU wins in the second round. Like, we all agree. I do have Houston beating them in the Sweet 16. My Sweet 16 matchup is Florida against Vandy, VCU against Houston, but I do have Vandy going up against Houston, and just like Jonah also predicted, I have Houston going over Vandy. I'm not going to go into more detail than that about why. The other upside I have is kind of earlier on. I have Texas A&M beating St. Mary's as well.
That's a 10-7, Davian. That's not an upset.
Fair. I mean, it's the rankings, man. It's a 7 seed, 10 seed. St. Mary's is favored.
Here, well, let's have Jonah. What do you classify as an upset seeding wise? 7-10 is not. A great question. A 10 over a 7 is not, in my eyes. I don't see that as an upset. I see anything larger than that, like an 11 over a 6 or 12 over a 5. Even 11 over a 6 now is more of a toss up, but I'm willing to give some leeway to an 11 over a 6, in my personal opinion.
This is an excellent question. It honestly, I think, has more to do with, I guess, the ratio difference of the seeds than the actual, I would consider, for example, I'd consider an 8 over a 5 an upset, or a 4 over a 1 would be an upset, but a 10 over a 7 is not.
Right.
Okay.
That's round of 60. Round of 64, though, 11 over 6 is the smallest possible seed difference that would constitute an upset.
I agree.
Fair.
But anyways, I had Texas A&M as well, but I just didn't want to I was like, oh, it's just like a pushover. But yeah, VCU, typically we see, not typically, but for the most part, we do see one double-digit seed go to make it to the Sweet 16, make it to the second weekend. VCU and USF are my top two possible schools that could meet that criteria. And again, if I want to adhere to that rule, I might as well just pick VCU over Illinois. I think that's going to be a toss-up. But David, who do you wind up having then? You had Florida over Houston?
I had Houston over Vandy.
Houston over Florida. Houston over Vandy.
Houston over Vandy, yeah. I think that I really like this Vandy team as well. This Florida team has really impressed me at times, but I think at times they have at times shown their flaws. And it's not in the sense of how many losses they have, but in their actual gameplay itself. So that's why I'm picking Houston over Vandy.
Yeah. All right. Moving over to the West, I'll take this one, and then we'll go around. I have Arizona going all the way through. I have Utah State over Villanova. Villanova being 8 is honestly, I looked at Villanova's overall resume. I'm like, this team's an 8. That's kind of crazy. But I have Utah State over Villanova representing the Mountain West. Currently, I have Wisconsin over High Point. If I had to pick a 12 over a 5, I'd pick High Point. I really didn't like Wisconsin playing against High Point. I think High Point I would take over some other 5. Like, if High Point was going up against Texas Tech, I'd be a lot more willing to pick High Point, but I'm a little 50-50 on High Point in Wisconsin. I have Arkansas over Hawaii. I have the winner of the first 4 game over BYU. Obviously, the big thing for them is the injury to Saunders, and BYU just looked like a completely different program since Saunders went down for the year. And I would not be surprised if AJ DeBonsa has this NBA draft prospect moment where he just takes over the tournament, just drags this BYU kicking and streaming to a deep run. But I just don't see with this BYU team. I believed in the past, and I've gotten burned. And although they have a better star, again, they just have looked really bad down the stretch. They haven't really shown any flashes to me that they can still go on a deep run. Gonzaga over Kennesaw State, Mizzou over Miami, Purdue over Queens. Then I have in my Sweet 16, I have Purdue over Georgia. I have Arizona over Arkansas. Man, Acuff for Arkansas balled out in the SEC tournament. Again, another like big game type of player, really takes over games. Wouldn't be surprised if, again, we're talking about people who could really drag their team kicking and streaming. I wouldn't be surprised if he potentially led Arkansas to an upset over Arizona. And then I have Arizona over Purdue, where I have Arizona punching their ticket to the Final Four. Purdue looked great in the Big Ten tournament. Obviously had a bit of an easier route per se because they did get Nebraska, UCLA, but you still beat Michigan very definitively. And it was a game where it really looked like Purdue was the better team the entire game. Michigan had its moments where it looked like they were potentially going to get into it, but Purdue just kept slamming their doors shut. So I have Purdue going pretty deep. Gonzaga, 3-line. This isn't the same Gonzaga we've seen in years past. I'm pretty down on them this year, but I really don't like any of the 6-11, BYU, Texas, and NC State. I don't like Gonzaga, but I don't like any of those schools a lot more, so I have Gonzaga over them. And yeah, that's pretty much what I got. Wisconsin's guard play could potentially get them far, but Arkansas would be my underdog to come out of this, but I got Arizona over Purdue. I'm pretty chalk with when it comes to
Raffi, respectfully, West. You're completely wrong. Because it's
wow, I'm so
LIU
surprised.
all the way.
Clip that. We're clipping that. That was. We have two people now that can attest to Davian picking LIU over Arizona.
No,
you don't
I'm
have
kidding.
just me now. I'm not taking crazy pills.
No, I'm just kidding. I ain't doing that. Jonah, I'm just gonna go through my mind real quick. Because I got Arizona over Utah State again. My Sweet 16 is Arizona over Arkansas, Purdue over Gonzaga, Arizona making it out. I do have Mizzou beating Miami. I also agree. I do think BYU is going to lose in the first round. I am leaning. I might switch after this podcast to picking High Point over Wisco, but I feel like this Wisco team has shown to have some definitive wins at times, and that does play a factor as well. But a lot of my reasoning is very similar to Raffi's, so I won't really get into it that much. But Jonah, passing it on to you, what do you think? And please tell me LIU all the way.
So yeah, without spoiling anything, I have Long Island in the Final Four, but
yes.
Okay, no.
Moving on.
Yeah. Okay, well, to actually start, I am going to be a little less chalky in this quadrant. I do have 9, 10, 11 winning. One, Utah State's just the better team than Villanova. As for Mizzou, it's really just the game is in St. Louis. I think that home crowd is going to propel Mizzou to a big win. And then, honestly, with whoever it is, Texas or NC State, I'm going to pick them over BYU. It's just, yeah. BYU was very close to having their seed plummeting because of the Richie Saunders injury, but then they played a little bit better. I kind of feel like it's not sustainable. That lack of depth is going to show. They're not a balanced team. I'm going to pick them. And I have Mizzou, Sweet 16. The St. Louis crowd is going to carry them. Purdue is going to have the post-conference championship hangover. Momentum is not a thing. If anything, sometimes the teams with momentum can falter. I know Florida won last year after winning their conference tournament, but we've also seen teams win their conference tournament, be on a high. Teams like Iowa a few years ago, when Seton Hall went on a run to win the Big East, and then they just lose immediately. So yeah, I have Arkansas, Arizona, Gonzaga, Mizzou in that Sweet 16. With Arkansas, oh my God. That Arkansas-Vandy SEC title game, like you just watch it and you're thinking, these are two incredible basketball teams. But I don't know. I think Arizona's too good everywhere. They're kind of like Houston where you can just kind of count on them to make a basket when they need one. So give me Arizona. Mizzou's Cinderella run ends here. Give me Arizona, Gonzaga. And honestly, I think Arizona's just kind of a better team than Gonzaga. They're going to win that, and it's not going to be that close.
Yeah. Purdue, I was surprised by this, but you kind of hit the nail on the head too. Winning your conference championship, and obviously you have so many conference championships. Only one school wins March Madness, wins the national championship. Obviously, there's not going to be a good ratio of teams who win their conference championship to winning the national title game. But to your point, there's really not a direct correlation between, well, if you win your conference championship game, you're going to go this far. You have a higher chance of winning the national championship. There's really not a correlation between between those two things, and a lot of people point that out over the past few days. So that's definitely interesting. If you bow out early in your conference championship, that is a sign that they're likely not going to go very far in March Madness. But to your point, if you wind up winning your respective conference championship game, that's not exactly an indication, especially with, again, Purdue going to the Elite Eight. I don't really fear any of these. I guess Mizzou, obviously you have the St. Louis factor, but Purdue's Indiana, people can make the drive. I'm not too concerned about that. But this program is also Purdue, where obviously they went on that deep run where they lost to UConn a couple years ago. But outside of that, Purdue, very well known for losing to double-digit seeds. So definitely an upset watch team. All right, moving over to the Midwest. I'll wrap this one, and then I'll send it over to you guys again. I got Michigan, St. Louis, Akron over Texas Tech, JT Toppin. I think that injury is just going to be too much for Texas Tech, although they have looked good in his absence, but still, that's such a big loss for them. I think that really caps them. Do I take Hofstra now? That was the what's his name? Adam Williams? What was his last name? I'm blanking on his last name. But there was that whole thing where he might not even be playing for Alabama right now. There was a whole case right now about how he got arrested, $5,000 bail, just got bailed out, no longer on Alabama's campus. So his status is up in the air. Second leading scorer for Alabama, so that's obviously going to throw a wrench into things. So I might change this to Hofstra potentially. Then I have Tennessee over the winner of Miami, Ohio, SMU, Virginia, Kentucky, Iowa State. I have Michigan over Bama. Again, I might wind up changing that. It might wind up being Michigan versus Akron potentially. I might have a 12-13 and then Akron going to the Sweet 16 to take on Michigan. Then I have Iowa State over Virginia, followed by Iowa State coming out and beating Michigan in the Elite Eight. Michigan is really good, but they showed some flaws. We saw in the Big Ten tournament. Great record, great resume as a whole, but this Iowa State team, I think people are also undermining as well. They are coming out of the Big 12. I think the Big 12, and I don't really think this is something that can be debated, was by far the best conference this year, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see at least 3 schools from the Big 12 represented in the Final Four.
Fair. Rafi, all what you said kind of just convinced me to kind of sway my opinion a bit. So I have Michigan making it out of here. I have Michigan beating Iowa State. The Alabama Hofstra, I didn't know anything about that. Akron, I don't know why I didn't pick them off the bat. I think I was just kind of like I started looking by digits, especially because I think I was picking the Midwest last.
David, you gotta be picking by the real metric, mascots, and which mascots.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Actually, it's vibes, Rafi. That's it. That's where you gotta pick from. So yeah, I do have Akron over Texas Tech. But I do have Michigan making out. I know this Michigan team has shown to be beatable at times, but I really think overall they're a great team. There's a reason why for a while they were favored to win the national championship. Which is why I'm picking them to make it out and into the Final Four. Jonah, I think you have some interesting thoughts for this region. I'm curious, what do you got?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what I told you before to make you think I have interesting thoughts, but I do have interesting thoughts nonetheless. So
that's why we have you on the podcast.
I just got the vibe, you know.
Yeah, I am going to follow in Rafi's footsteps. I have Akron in my Sweet 16. And for lack of a more sophisticated explanation, JT Toppin's out. Texas Tech looked fun initially. Now they look terrible without him. And as for Alabama, I actually didn't know about that issue either. But the Fighting Charles Bediacos kind of struggle on defense. And then Akron can really just light it up at any moment. I think that's a bad matchup. Give me Akron. On the bottom half of the region, I'm going to take Tennessee over Virginia for the exact opposite region. Virginia, a lot of their offense is kind of reliant on their three-point shot. No one defends the three in the country better than Tennessee. Give me Tennessee. Other than that, it's going to be mostly chalk. I still have – well, actually, I'm going to briefly talk about it. We know it's not an upset, but let's give a shout-out to Steve Nash's alma mater, the Santa Clara Broncos. they are a good team. Just because they're not a Miami, Ohio, where they just play an easy schedule. They beat real teams. They passed the eye test.
They beat St. Mary's. St. Mary's in the West Coast Conference not championship game, but in the semis.
Yeah, no, they're a good team, and they have real NBA draft talent. Like Allen Graves, he's going to be a first rounder. He's kind of your modern wing that you basically want. But still, they're going to lose to Iowa State. We're going to have Michigan versus Iowa State, and there might be some questions about maybe Michigan and their guard play. I do think it could have problems when it comes to them winning the whole thing, but it'll be good enough to get past Iowa State. I don't know what it is, but I feel like Iowa State's been a 2 seed, 3 seed for 10 years in a row now, and they've always lost somewhere around the Elite 8 or Sweet 16. Give me Michigan.
Yeah. But then again, people always said, oh, Purdue never goes deep, and then they finally made it to the championship game. Oh, Virginia never goes deep. They lost to 16 seed, proceeds to win the national championship. At some point, it's got to happen. So that's why I'm in on Iowa State. Just a little bit of stuff, too. Aiden Holloway was arrested this morning facing felony marijuana charges. So still an unknown on if he is going to be available for Alabama. And this is unfortunate, too, because if we went into – you saw me stutter when I was going through my bracket. That's because I had Alabama over Michigan because of how good Purdue's offense looked against Michigan. Alabama's offense ranked by KenPom even better than Purdue, arguably the best offense in college basketball. So I thought potentially that could have given Michigan some fits and could have potentially been a big upset that we could have seen down the line. But obviously if you potentially lose your second best scorer, it's similar last year. You saw the Brandon Miller situation that obviously affected my thoughts on Alabama that year. Obviously wanted to play in games, so maybe Holloway wants to play in games. But as of this moment in time, I'm going to just say, you know what? Maybe Hofstra takes it. Regardless, there's enough, as you mentioned, Jonah, for me to get on the Akron train and get Akron to the Sweet 16. If I had to, like VCU and Akron and South Florida, my 3 top, if you're going to pick a double-digit seed in the Sweet 16, those would be my top 3 in my personal opinion. Not in that order, but regardless. All right, Final Four. Jonah, you're the guest. I'll hand it off to you first. What do you have going on in your Final Four, and who do you have winning the national championship this year?
Yeah, so to start, I'm incredibly chalky. We have 3 1s and a 2. And honestly, I'm not sure I feel – because, I mean, if we look at it from a analytics standpoint, Duke, Arizona, and Michigan are 3 of the top 5 teams ever since the year 2000. I can't believe I just said ever since the year 2000, but that's besides the point. But they are very strong 1 seeds, kind of like last year. We're going to see fewer upsets in the tournament, at least for the foreseeable future. So I feel pretty confident in that. And then Houston, I think Florida's definitely a step down from them. That's why I have them there. But now onto the matchups. We have a Final Four rematch, Duke versus Houston. And Duke is going to come out with a vengeance. They're going to get out to a nice early lead, but then the injuries are going to catch up to them. They're going to stumble. They're going to fall apart just like they did last year. Houston's going to edge out yet another victory. And then I think this is also where the guard play, the lack of the ability to just get a bucket when you want it, when you need it, that's going to catch up with Michigan. Give me Arizona versus Houston International Championship for the Big 12. And I think it's going to be an explosive, high-scoring game, a rematch of the Big 12 Championship. It's going to be another great game, just like we saw.
Davian.
All right, so I got a 5, a 2, and 2 1s. So actually, a bit better, I'd say. I really like this Houston team. But when you talk about losing gas, when you talk about a legacy game, when you talk about the vibes, the mascots, I got St. John's beating Houston in the Final Four.
They don't pump their own gas. They don't.
I then on the other side of the equation, Arizona against Michigan. I like this Michigan team. I predicted this Michigan team to win the Big Ten, which they didn't. I'm a huge Michigan fan. Go Blue. But with all that being said, I'm still picking this Arizona team. I think this Arizona team all around is a really, really good team. And when it comes to who will be the national champion, I'm going to go with Arizona. As much I think St. John's Cinderella run comes to an end in Indianapolis, I think the Wildcats finally prove it, just like Jonah just said, and win. I'd kind of lock that into my bracket. I won't change that, but I might change other things in my bracket in terms of the earlier rounds. But yeah, Raffi, let's hear your boring take.
I have Florida over St. John's, and you guys will never believe this. I have Arizona over Iowa State to play Florida. Where do you guys want to take a random guess at who I have winning the national championship? It starts with an A and also ends with an A and rhymes with
Akron?
Yes. No. Alabama. Alabama, David, was right there for you with that.
Alabama.
Ivy League education. No, I'm just kidding. I have Arizona over Florida. Again, I think we're all in agreement that if there's a year for Arizona to win the national championship, this is the year for them. Tommy Lloyd, he's got to go on a deep run eventually. They got to get out of the Elite Eight. They got to go on a deep run, win the national championship again. So I'm going to go Arizona over Florida as well, which means Arizona is 100% losing to 16 seed, as all three of us on this podcast went 3 for 3 on picking Arizona. Yep. But we'll see what happens. Hopefully we're not back here in a week and Davian and I are just talking about Arizona losing to, what was it, to LIU? Davian, maybe that LIU.
Sharks, all the way.
That's the worst.
Hey, clip that. If you clip that part, all I'm saying is that just clip that part. Don't include the part that I said was a joke.
That might,
and I'm a genius.
That might be the worst possible 16 seed to upset Arizona, just because I know that if that were to, for some reason, happen, Davian would be like this the entirety of next week's podcast. And Davian, for that, I'd be punishing you to another 45-minute podcast, just so you can just realize what you've done in the second. So we'll see if LIU can pull off the upset. A lot of people picking Arizona. They're the second most picked team. A lot of people picking Duke, obviously just because it's Duke, and a lot of people like the trendy, it's Duke. And then Michigan followed by, I believe it's Florida and Houston. A lot of people are split on Florida and Houston, and I certainly don't blame them. So we'll see what happens, but let us know in the comments below what your guys' thoughts are on our brackets and just overall what your guys' picks are. Definitely let us know. Jonah, thank you as always for coming on. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and especially, it's always a pleasure talking to you, but especially this time of year, just because it's lovely to have another person who loves brackets, much as I do talking about brackets. So for Davian, for Jonah, I'm Raffi. We hope you enjoyed. Have a good one, and it's finally time for March Madness. See ya.
Peace.